Okay, thanks very much for that. And I guess we have great reason to be optimistic given the Gen X's and Y's we've seen here. Thank you. I'm Lesley, Alway, Director of Asialink Arts. Over the last 10 to 12 years, there have been at least 100 new museums built and opened in China every year. In 2011, there were in fact over 300 at the zenith of that redevelopment. In searching for a definition of optimism, I think that that is a great vote of confidence in the value of our cultural infrastructure. But what are the motivations for this incredible investment by government and private developers in this cultural infrastructure and the development of this museum boom? Does China have the software, the curatorial, the marketing, the operating systems and staff to match the hardware? What, in fact, are the opportunities that this museumification of China present for the region, for the rest of the world? To help us understand the scope and scale of this incredible development, I'll be joined by my two fellow panellists, C.Jacobson, writer from Shanghai and author of New Museums in China, followed by Kingsley Jayasekera, Director of Communications, Marketing and Digital for West Kowloon District, and particularly talking about the new MPlus development. Please join me first in welcoming Clare.
Thanks so much, Lesley, and thanks to the folks at Agenda for bringing me here. I am an architectural writer, so I'm going to give you my story from an architectural viewpoint. That's my book. The great number of new museums in China demonstrate that architectural production is moving from the country's rapid urbanization to the niceties of culture. This museum building boom comes with great government support. The bulk of museums, in fact, are government-sponsored. 87% of all museums in 2012 were government-run institutions. And in just 2 short years, between 2008 and 2011, the Chinese government appropriated 5.2 billion renminbi, which is roughly 800,000 US dollars, in support of museums and memorial halls. Now, this investment is important. The large government expenditure indicates the systemic value being placed on museums throughout the country. Museum buildings are used urbanistically to establish the cultural and architectural centers of Chinese cities. So within a sea of somewhat anonymous buildings in the urban fabric of China, these buildings stand out and make a difference. They are positioned at the heart of many new urban developments as they express the aspirations of a changing society. So as a church or a town hall might be the center of a town in the West, so too museums and other cultural institutions such as opera houses and libraries are the hearts of new towns and new developments in China. Both government-sponsored and private museums are used in this urbanistic way, and I'll give you 2 examples from Shanghai, where I'm from, of 2 major developments going on there. One is the former site of the World Expo, where 2 government-run institutions are key to new development. The China Art Museum, which is China's largest museum currently, and the Power Station of Art, which is China's first state-sponsored museum of contemporary art. These are key to this large new development. Further down the river in Shanghai, at another site of development, the West Bund, 2 private museums anchor development there. That is the Long Museum and the Yutes Museum. So at both of these sites and throughout China, these museum buildings are built first. The housing, offices, and whatnot come later. So what exactly am I talking about when I'm talking about this museum building boom? Lesley already mentioned roughly 100 buildings a year. The government figures between 2000 and 2011, China built 1,198 museums. And China's State Administration of Cultural Heritage said that the country had, in 2012, a total of 3,400 museums. Now, that is just a fifth of the estimated 17,500 museums in the US, where I come from. But the rate of construction compared to that, I think anywhere in the world, is rather astronomical. So speaking of the US, which I was just a moment ago, the current museum building boom in China is somewhat comparable to that in the US in the end of the 19th century, a time that one author refers to as the US's urban moment, when cities were really establishing themselves. And of course, China's urban moment and its museum boom are happening at a much larger scale and a much quicker pace than that in the US. But I think both booms have the same intention, and that is for cities to say, we have arrived. Now, more important to me than the quantity of the buildings is the quality. You see, I hope, the great variety and of the architectural design in these slides from the book. In fact, 11 Pritzker Prize-winning architects have built or are building new museums in China. The Pritzker is essentially the Nobel of architecture. It's awarded annually to an architect for his or her career's work. And Wang Shu, who is China's first recipient of the prize, he won it in 2012, is best known for his museum design. Now, you might say, who cares about star architects and what they're up to? But frankly, I think that so many talented art designers are spending their efforts on this particular building type at this particular time in this country is significant. I do need to mention that it's not just star architects, of course. New architecture firms throughout China are establishing their reputations with museum work. Museums are prestige projects, no doubt, and they garnish a lot of publicity for new firms. Museums are often taken on by small firms in China instead of by the large design institutes that build most of the country. So this combination of talented foreign architects and talented local architects means a lot of quality museum building. Now, sadly, the same quality does not yet exist in other aspects of museums. The curation, exhibition design, outreach, etc. These are all falling behind the architectural production. And museums, in fact, are often designed without a specific program, but rather to have flexible space for different opportunities. You might have read the disheartening media stories about fake art, poor security systems, low visitor numbers, empty museums, etc. And I don't discount these stories and recognize them as a true problem, but yet I am giddily optimistic, some friends say stupidly optimistic, but still very optimistic about the potential of new museums and not just their architecture. I think we have to recognize that the museum type is an imported form. It first arrived in China in 1868 when a French Jesuit brought his collection of stuffed mammals and set up a museum. And of course, there were many years in recent history when museums throughout China were not exactly active. But I can personally witness in just the 5 short years that I've lived in Shanghai, the great growth in quality in all aspects of museums, again, not just their architecture. So I want to end with a crystal ball look into the future of this museum building boom. Sadly, I don't really have that crystal ball, so I can't say much, but I can offer two stories that might inform the future. First comes from a Shanghai-based architect I know who compares this boom to a previous building boom in China, throughout China. This was a stadium building boom that coincided with the Beijing Olympics. And this architect contends that once the Olympics were over, the rush to build stadiums was also over. He thinks the same will happen to museums, that there'll be this short window of great productivity and a very quick end. Another story which might affect the construction of new museums comes from a symposium in Beijing last month, where President Xi Jinping made a call for, quote, no more weird architecture. Yeah, it remains to be seen what he means by weird architecture, but as we all know, museum buildings, and I think as a lot of these slides show, are some of the most adventurous architectural designs. So if by weird he means adventurous, we're really in trouble. I'm not sure, but I think regardless of the future building, the new museums in China that have been built make great contributions to China's architecture and urban environment and offer great potential for the country's future cultural expression. Thanks so much.
Hello everybody, I'm Kingsley, Director of Communications Marketing Digital for West Kowloon, and I'm going to talk about MPlus. So, MPlus, West Kowloon. And really following on from what's been talked about, I guess our approach really is talking about building a museum from the inside out. There's a lot talked about optimism, and we've talked about this. So this is about optimism. This is our blank canvas. This is the space we have to work with. 40 hectares of land on the West Kowloon Peninsula, on Hong Kong Harbour, facing Hong Kong. So while Sydney has an amazing view, I think we actually may be able to possibly rival it with our view from our toilet windows. And dressing rooms, with a big debate about the view from the dressing rooms. This is the master plan. As I say, 40 hectares, up to 17 cultural venues, and the little red dotted line circles where the MPlus Museum will be, the future museum of visual culture. Following on from what Clare was talking about, we had lots of architects involved in the competition, lots of very exciting ideas, and I think we had 3 Pulitzer Prize winning architects in the list. And interestingly enough, the final decision to go with Herzog and de Meuron's design was quite interesting, because some people said, oh, it's quite simple and plain, and said, where's the money going? But actually, it's a very, very simple, elegant design. Ultimately, though, I think Clare also said a lot of these museums aren't defined with a clear purpose, and MPlus very much has a purpose. It is a museum of visual culture, and it's really, really keen to be seen to be looking at the world from a Hong Kong perspective. I think this idea of perspective, often museums are very, very dominated in the past by Western thinking, and the world looks very different depending where you are. It looks very different from when you're looking at it from Australia. It certainly looks very different when you're looking at it from Hong Kong. So visual culture from the beginning, what does that mean? Obviously visual art, but right from the beginning we're talking about design and architecture. And you can see something that's just entered our collection, one of the neon signs in Hong Kong. These signs are being taken down and we're actually preserving them. And also moving image and film, obviously some quite commercial film, but also moving into art film. So building a museum from the inside out, that means building a team, a collection, a building, and audiences. And we're very much focusing on doing that all at the same time. Starting really with a team. We currently have around 50 people in place. There'll be 500 when we open. The ratio at the moment is about half local from Hong Kong, another 25% from the rest of Asia, and then 25% from Europe and the US. And that's been interesting because we have to develop the skills and talent. There is a shortage of trained curators and trained expertise in Hong Kong, so we're doing a lot to develop that. The collection, there's already about 4,500 works in the collection, and we got a good start when Uli Sig, who is a leading collector of Chinese contemporary art, gave us his collection of 2,500 works. That was a very, very helpful beginning, and that collection has already been shown in Sweden. It will be seen in Manchester next year, and maybe some other places before it comes to Hong Kong in 2016 for a temporary exhibition. So starting off with this meant that actually there's a lot of inputs already. And you can already start to explore the collection online because we revamped the website and we've given a very new style to the website. And if anyone ever wants to see antiquated websites, go to Hong Kong and look at a government website. They are the worst in the world. So that's not only rethinking the content, but that has also informed the process of the building. Knowing what we're putting in it, what we're going to do, has had an impact within the building, how we're using the spaces. And interestingly enough, this is the found space in the centre of the building, and that's partly defined by the location. The stepped effect is basically the rail tunnels that run through the reclaimed land, and the land was reclaimed to build a rail link to the airport. And what Herzog and de Moda suggests is that we dig down and open up that space to create a very, very dynamic thing, and to give the building some form of rooting in a very impermanent setting. And really looking at how we can open up the building, make the buildings very, very clear and open, so you get a good movement of people, rather than creating, often is the case, these sort of like, as they're called, concrete culture bunkers. You know, very, very forbidding spaces that people can't find their way into. And again, Hong Kong has a few of those, and a lot of countries do. I mean, it's a style of architecture that often people find quite intimidating as a member of the public to enter into. So really we're talking about the idea of the museum as a building. It's a relationship between content and audience. And Robert talked about interesting ideas about inequality and what's happening in cities. Hong Kong is the kind of case study of inequality in cities in terms of wealth and poverty, in terms of property prices. And we have to be very conscious of that and what our role is. Anyone who's been following the news and seen the things going on in Occupy will realise how strongly these things resonate in Hong Kong society. And art has a part to play in that. Trying to understand a bit about audiences, there's been a whole process with Mobile MPlus of doing nomadic exhibitions, going out into the community. The first of these was an exhibition in Yau Ma Tei, where a number of local artists did exhibits in different spaces, so taking it into a very, very local area in Kowloon, and really, really trying to bring art into those environments and really trying to engage with people. We also had the first exhibition of major inflatables on the empty site, and this attracted 150,000 people. It wasn't without controversy, because one of the works we bought was a piece by Paul McCarthy, his large pile of inflatable poo. And that created a certain stir. Interesting enough, it was interesting to see that Paul McCarthy's work creates a stir even in Paris. So the fact that actually it appeared in Hong Kong and actually, you know, attracted a large number of visitors didn't seem, in the end now, doesn't look so strange. But we're in a very strange environment in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is also the centre of the contemporary art market. So you have very fast advances, but other areas where the public go, what on earth is this? We heard about the statement that was made about weird architecture. Attached to that, there was also a statement that said that art should be uplifting and for the betterment of society. And I think that's one of the trends that may grow, and that has a knock-on effect into Hong Kong. We did our first exhibition of the architecture collection, which showed off the competition entries for the MPlus, but also showed off how we were displaying architecture. And we had 20,000 people come to that, which was a record for that gallery. And one of the most recent things we did was an online project where we did a study of Hong Kong's neon, where we actually mapped the neon, and we did a crowdsourcing project where people could take pictures. And people went around taking images. We had 4,000 images of neon signs, creating a record of the neon in the city, which was a very, very exciting thing. And also something that I think a lot of local people really, really found important and valued, but also had international reach. Building onto that, we're also making sure that we're actually working and building public programs. We have an education department that are going out and engaging people. And one thing that's very interesting about Hong Kong is young people and families really, really love to engage with arts and culture. It's the key. It's the way forward. People love to make things and do things, and family is the centre of all that. It's the real beginning point in capturing people when they're young, and also giving them pleasure. There's an interesting thing in Hong Kong. Everyone learns a classical musical instrument, and they all learn how to play it, but they don't really often learn how to enjoy it. It's seen as a task. So what's interesting is if introducing arts and culture in a pleasurable way into people's lives can have real impacts. And a growing number of internships and docent programs. Again, you know, big interest from people. We took docents to Venice for the Biennale, and really working towards making sure that the staff are effectively more and more local. In many ways, I partly see, I have a completely local team, and I suppose in many ways a judgment of success is if I can put myself out of a job because I really am not relevant anymore. And that will be a really good thing for Hong Kong in the long term. Building a museum from the inside out, from my point of view, brings in lots of very interesting things. We had to get a collection management system. We have to look at how we're going to display that. There is no history of CRM in Hong Kong. It just doesn't done. Digital strategy, again, it's an interesting place. Everybody has a mobile, and mobile is the primary device. But in many ways, it's very, very behind the times in terms of digital. Fundraising and membership. This is an interesting challenge in places like Hong Kong, where private money is somehow often seen as tied towards buying influence. Sponsorship is viewed with some form of suspicion. People don't often like to give money. And creating a culture of fundraising is going to be an interesting challenge. Ticketing, admission and sales. Again, Hong Kong has a very, very poor, ticketing systems, really. They really aren't particularly advanced beyond basic admission. So all these sort of things, digital asset management, all these things have to happen. So it's a very, very long process. And I guess the important point for us very much is how we work towards doing all these things. So finally we get to the point with a building, we have a clear vision of what it's for, and from the time we open our doors, it's available and we understand how it works. But also recognising the building is just another tool. And hang on to this core idea, which is very, very important, this vision of it being from a Hong Kong perspective and it being 20th and 21st century visual culture and all the range of what that means. But I think really, ultimately, I suppose what I would say is from that point of view, the building is a nice thing to have, but it isn't at all. MPlus is more than a museum, and in reality, it actually already exists. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think the good news is that we're now back on track with time, so we do have a few minutes for conversation and perhaps even for a question from the audience. I guess what I'm interested in to ask each of you is, to what extent do you think that these museums in China more broadly and in Hong Kong specifically are for local or global audiences? Claire, perhaps you'd like to comment. Local or global audiences in terms of their being... in terms of the rationale for their purpose, are they being targeted at the local population or for more global audiences, for visitors to the country? Sorry. Yeah.
I think for local audiences, this part of museums isn't exactly my expertise, but from my own experience, shows are visited by many more local people than tourists, and so I can only suspect targeted the same way.
Yeah. What about in Hong Kong?
I think that originally when the project was conceived way back in 1998, it was definitely about Hong Kong's place on the international stage, and it was about this idea of a global city. But increasingly over time, there's been a very, very strong local kind of feeling. And there's much more of an internalized idea. And I think that's reflected in the political agenda that's going on. But I think also any museum has to really, really secure its local audience first. Any museum that doesn't really, really work for the local population, the taxpayers, you know, for the people who surround it every day, I think is failing. So in the end, I think that for us, which is why the projects we're looking at are very much about trying to find really what works for the local population, finding out the kind of issues. And I think that the broad agenda of visual culture actually helps that, I think.
And I think one of the issues about building museums in China is really the convergence of commercial and government interests, of private and public interests. To what extent do you think that that is an issue in terms of building these museums and then running these museums? And is in fact that now any different from what's happening in the West?
I think it's different in the style that it's done. I mean, I still remember the first time I went to the Museum of Modern Art in New York and saw all these Bank of America banners, and I was like, what's going on here? Because, you know, private funding had moved to a different model. Now I go to the Met and there's a gift shop in every corner. So I think in the West, people are kind of used to those kind of commercial entities. They're not so used to what happens in China sometimes, which is exhibitions that are actually funded by the artist, you know, government that has a hand in suggesting what exhibitions are run. So there's a different kind of cross. But yeah, there is a great cross between private and public interests.
In fact, I think in many respects, a number of museums that people think might be private are in fact, you know, semi-government anyway, in terms of perhaps the personnel that are running them, or in terms of access, because often the only way that a developer can get access to land is in fact from the government, is to build a museum, which goes to the heart of some of the motivations.
Land deals are a large part of it. A lot of new residential compounds in China will have a museum or other cultural building at its front, as you mentioned, kind of a land deal. And sometimes after the housing is sold off, the former museum takes on different uses, specifically commercial uses.
Yeah. Kingsley?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the end, I mean, West Kowloon has had quite a long history, and partly originally the idea was that developers would do a lot of this work, but there is a big suspicion of private developers. I mean, you know, particularly I think with their site, it's probably the most expensive real estate in the world. And so how you kind of separate that from, and there is in Hong Kong very, very clear separation between what the government does and what happens privately. And one of the big challenges will be how we can kind of break that down. As I said, it's an interesting challenge around fundraising particularly, and how we can get, you know, secure money from people and also give them the benefits. So it's certainly one of the biggest challenges, I think. Because there isn't really a clear one. There's not the clear, you know, we haven't had the situations happen in places like the UK where there's an acceptance of this sort of sponsorship.
Yeah. Now, I think we have a couple of roving mics. So is there a question from the audience about... Yeah, it's up in the middle there.
A great variety. I can speak about Shanghai. There's, in the last 5 years, a new auto museum with a great collection of like 1960 muscle cars from the US. There's a film museum of Shanghai history, was very, did a lot of films in the 1920s, and the museum focuses on that. There's a glass museum of both international and local artists. There are also art museums, but there is a different type of museum in China that I think it's important to recognize. There are, in fact, two words for a museum. One is an artifact museum. The other might be more properly translated as Kunsthalle. And so these are museums without permanent exhibitions that, or rather permanent collections that have exhibitions coming and going. So what is in them depends on what month it is.
And Kingsley, I guess you addressed that partly in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very clear idea what will be going in. I mean, say we've got 4,500 works. There's a very clear direction to the collection. And because the collection stretches across architecture, design, and moving image, that kind of gives a very clear indication of how the building should work. So I think from that point of view, in some ways there's a very clear understanding what the end point should be, which has some risks to it. But I think that part of this process that we're going through of doing these exhibitions and the learnings from it also allowing us to kind of not get so rigidly stuck at the beginning that we don't have room to try. I mean, in a way, it's quite fascinating. It's just a blank canvas. You have to re-examine everything right from the beginning, which is very exciting. I mean, in terms of how you display works, in terms of your museum guides, how much do we use new technology? I mean, again, everyone's focusing on things like bring your own device as a way of doing that. But, in Hong Kong, where everybody's glued to their mobile phone, do you want to actually create a slightly different culture? So there's lots of interesting issues that we have to tease out.
Thanks for that. Another question down the front here.
My question for Kingsley. In regards to the statistics, last night we heard that Sydney Opera House gets 8 million visitors a year, which is 30% of the national population. What's your forecast on visitation rights? How does it compare to the actual population? Because I'm thinking that's going to be a benefit for raising funds.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, for MPlus, I mean, realistically, we're talking between 5,000 or 10,000 visitors a day. Yeah, I mean, the initial projection was going to, somewhere between, and it's very hard to be absolutely sure. I mean, that was a start point, so you kind of do the maths and you get to, 2 million or whatever. I mean, the interesting point is, when you talk about local population, how you define local population. And if you're in Hong Kong, you're talking about 7 million people. We're also on the new fast rail link that links you directly up to the mainland and takes you up very quickly. And then, of course, there's a huge Pearl River Delta catchment area. Then beyond that, you've got the rest of China. So one interesting point will be is how we can ensure that the local population feel that they can actually feel that this is their space. When, if you know about Hong Kong, there are huge amounts of mainland visitors coming anyway. I mean, one of the interesting debates in Hong Kong is the fact of ownership of these public areas. And there's a lot of local people who get quite annoyed by the massive number of mainlanders who come in every day to shop and visit. So I think that's an interesting thing. I think the numbers is one issue, but actually it's going to be how we actually kind of manage that difference between these large numbers of visitors coming in from elsewhere in China and then our local population. But I think with any museum, I think when you first open it, there is a little bit of, you start with some estimates, and then often, if you're lucky, it actually far exceeds it. I think Lars, who actually runs the MPlus, he was the first director of the Tate Modern, and they did their estimates, and then of course the numbers were far in excess of what they were thought.
Thank you. I think that what's been demonstrated, not only does this incredible museum boom in China, Hong Kong, throw up enormous challenges for the museums in that country themselves, but I think it will also throw up challenges for the West, because as you have large populations becoming much more familiar with this abundance of cultural infrastructure and far more educated, and an huge increase in tourism from mainland China to other parts of the world, what does this actually mean for the rest of the museums in the region, but also the rest of the museums in the West? And are you, I guess if you're not from China, are you actually prepared for, I guess, this newly educated, more familiar museum-identified population? I guess that's the challenge for you, and let's hope we're optimistic about that. Thank you very much for our panellists. Thank you. Thank you.